It's my pleasure to be able to introduce one of the leading members in Congress when it comes to space issues. We're happy to have Congressman Jim Bridenstine joining us here today from Oklahoma's 1st District. Is that correct? 1st District. Yes. That's right. the number one district. He was elected to Congress in 2012. And he serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And I think in our community, Representative Bridenstine is best known for the legislation he introduced last year, the American Space Renaissance Act, which really was a broad piece of legislation with a lot of really innovative proposals for how to change American space policy in civilian, commercial, and military. Representative Bridenstine began his career as a naval aviator. He flew the E-2C and then later the F-18 Hornet. I was reading in his bio that he is credited with having 333 carrier landings. I assume there are an equal number of takeoffs. No discrepancy there.
That's not what it exactly means.
Okay, might not. Well, then we might ask you about that later. So we're really excited to have him here today to talk about the big space issues that are facing the new Trump administration and what we need to do in the policy community and in Congress and in this new administration. So please join me in welcoming Representative Jim Bridenstine.
Thank you for the introduction. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. Certainly CSIS and the Prague Security Studies Institute, thank you for putting this together. It is great to be here. I want to especially thank Dr. John Hamre. Is Dr. Hamre in the room by chance? No? Okay. Well, Dr. Hamre has spent a lot of time with me as a member of Congress, getting me smart on a whole host of issues that are especially space-related issues. And he spent a good bit of time. I also want to thank Roger Robinson, of course, chairman of the Prague Security Studies Institute, for having me. I understand General Raymond spoke last night at dinner. I was not able to attend. We've got a few things going on Capitol Hill, if you're not aware. And it's been very busy, but I have spent a good bit of time with General Raymond as well. He's been tremendously helpful to me as a member of Congress. So it is a great opportunity to be here. As far as having more takeoffs or more landings, when I was a young lieutenant junior grade in the United States Navy, we always had to walk onto the aircraft carrier and walk off of the aircraft carrier. We were always the last ones on the boat, or the last ones, the first ones on the boat when it was at shore, and then of course when it pulls in, you're the last one off the boat because you're walking on and off. Well, there was a time when I was young in my Navy career when the President of the United States actually flew out to my aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. You guys probably remember the incident. President George W. Bush flew out. And I was thrilled because as a young lieutenant, I think I might have been a lieutenant at this time, but I was still pretty junior in my squadron. The answer was, well, if I'm the last one off the boat, which is always the case, then I'm going to be the guy that gets to see the President of the United States when he comes on the Abraham Lincoln. Well, in this particular case, being the junior guy didn't help. They wanted to get the big wings off the aircraft carrier. I was flying the E-2 Hawkeye at the time, so my assignment was to get the aircraft. Well, we need the junior guys to get the aircraft off the aircraft carrier. So I do have one more takeoff than I have landing. I obviously landed on shore. So I guess as far as takeoffs and landings, I'm even, just not carrier. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I want to talk about a few things. You mentioned my comprehensive bill called the American Space Renaissance Act. This is a bill we put together last year, and we tried to look at space collectively. When you hear other governments, not the United States government, but other governments talk about space, you hear them use the phrase comprehensive national power. The idea that space is a part of their comprehensive national power. And in the United States, we have a whole host of different federal agencies and commercial entities that utilize space, but they look at it as a tool for their own agency, whether it's the United States Air Force, which of course has the preponderance of the space assets for the Department of Defense. They look at space, how do we use it for the war fight on the ground, or the war fight terrestrial in the atmosphere. It's a tool. Same with the United States Navy. They look at space for how do we navigate and communicate when we're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and we're completely detached from the rest of the world. How do we communicate and navigate in those circumstances? The United States Army has its own space programs. The intelligence community has its space program. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, of course, is very heavily now involved in space activities because they're purchasing commercial data. Well, a lot of that commercial data it has to be licensed by NOAA, which is another federal agency. And of course, to launch those activities into space, you have to get a launch license from FAA, the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, FAA, AST. And so all of these agencies have to work together. And we haven't even talked about NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and NASA, and their responsibilities. And what you find when you look at the American space enterprise, you find that all of these different organizations, in many cases, are duplicating efforts. And in many cases, they are not maximizing the utility of space or even the resources of the American taxpayer. So the question was, how do we make space even better? And the answer was, we need to look at it comprehensively. So the purpose of the American Space Renaissance Act was to do just that. We want space to be a part of our comprehensive national power. And that includes not just military, but diplomatic and soft power, and of course, scientific and engineering feats that uniquely are attributable to the American way of life and our preeminent spacefaring position in the world. So that's what that bill was all about, and we introduced it last year. Now, one thing that I think is especially important today, yesterday I was at the White House when the President signed the NASA Transition Authorization Act. It's a one-year authorization for NASA. We haven't done a NASA authorization since 2010, and now we did one. And I went to the White House, and the Vice President of the United States was standing right next to the President and members of Congress that were involved in this process, and he said he is looking forward to the day that the President signs an executive order reestablishing the National Space Council. That is going to be a monumental thing for this country as we think about space collectively. It will enable us to do things that are embedded in the American Space Renaissance Act. And of course, I'm not suggesting that, of course, my bill gets everything that it wants. It absolutely will not. But what we will be able to do is bring the different agencies together in an interagency process and say, where are we duplicating efforts? Where are we maybe not taking advantage of space in a way that maximizes its utility? So I want to talk for a second. I've got 5 concepts that I'm going to address where I believe the National Space Council will be an important organization. The number one thing I think that we have to consider as a country is space situational awareness. Right now, most people in this room are aware that space situational awareness is done by the Joint Space Operations Center operated by the United States Air Force out at Vandenberg Air Force Base. And they have a responsibility to do all of the conjunction analysis and reporting for the entire world. Not just for the Department of Defense, not just for commercial operators that are American, but also for foreign operators and even foreign commercial entities. They do it by default because historically they have been the only ones that have the capability. They've got the sensors, they've got the network, ultimately they've got the software, and they can do the conjunction analysis and the reporting. We have had testimony before my subcommittees. I'm on Strategic Forces Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee, and I'm on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. In the last Congress, I chaired the Subcommittee on the Environment, which oversees NOAA. About 40% of their budget is space-related activities, and I'm also on the Subcommittee on Space, which of course overlooks NASA. So I've heard this testimony. 75% of the manpower at the JSPOC is used to do conjunction reporting for the entire world and for commercial for free. And I want to be clear, the Joint Space Operations Center, it's never been their mission. It was never designed to do that. They do it by default because historically they were the only ones with that capability, and I hope everybody in this room is grateful that they have been doing it because it's been critically important for everybody. But it's not an Air Force mission at a time when you see all of the threats proliferating, and I probably would guess that General Raymond might have talked about those last night. But the idea that we've got direct ascent anti-satellite weapons and co-orbital anti-satellite weapons and spoofing and jamming and dazzling and hacking and all of these things that are going on, these challenges that we face, we need our warfighters understanding what the threats are, figuring out when those threats occur, is it a threat or is it an anomaly, and then ultimately being able to attribute that threat to an actor. And if they're running around the entire world trying to determine if a commercial communications satellite in low Earth orbit, which there's a whole host of those that are getting ready to be launched, is going to run into another commercial remote sensing satellite in low Earth orbit, that is problematic. It is taking away from a fundamental mission that is critical to the national security of the United States. And so I think we're moving to an era quickly where space situational awareness needs to move out of the domain of the United States military, and it needs to move to a civil agency. Now, I have said in public speeches that I think that civil agency ought to be the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. I have also said that we need to take that office and move it out of the FAA and make it a direct report to the Secretary of Transportation, elevating its position, if you will, in the Department of Transportation. I have also said that we don't need to be funding it at $19 million. If we do this, it's going to have to be better funded. But it's also true that we're not going to take those funds from the Department of Defense, especially the JSPOC, at a time when we're facing more threats than we've ever faced in the history of the United States of America in space. So, I want to emphasize for a second that we have had testimony from generals, and they tell us, we do not want to be the FAA for space. They've got other challenges. They're not funded for it. It's not their mission. And this is me talking now. And we need to do something about this. So I have been an advocate for moving it out of the DoD. I want to share with you for a second the history here. There was a time in this country when you look at air traffic, and you look all across the United States of America, and all of the radars and all of the controllers were military. The military was not designed to do commercial air traffic control. That's not what their purpose was, but they were doing it by default because they were the only ones who could. And that's kind of where we are in space right now. Although there's a number of collisions in the 1950s that were very high profile, and one in particular was that two commercial airliners collided over the Grand Canyon, killing 128 passengers, and that's when President Eisenhower threw down the gauntlet and he said, we're going to have some air traffic control in this country. And there were people out there that said, no, if you do this, it'll hurt the industry, it'll create regulation, it'll do great damage. People said that at the time. And then they created the FAA, and what they saw is that collisions went way down, safety went way up, people felt comfortable flying on commercial airlines in ways they hadn't done before. The airline industry thrived. Everything that some people said was going to happen went absolutely the opposite direction. And I'm not saying we're there right now as far as the space segment goes, but I'm saying we have to look at the history and look at how the markets respond to these kind of activities. So I think that's important. I also know that this is not an American issue. Space, by definition, has to be international because we're not the only ones there, and of course, space covers the whole world, not just the United States, and when you're in orbit, you're going to be flying over other countries. So we have to make sure that we are collaborating with international partners and allies and creating the standards and the norms that ultimately are in the best interest of American national security. And the only way we do that is to lead. We have to lead. And if you look across the entire world, I'm a Navy pilot by trade. I'm now in the Oklahoma Air National Guard, so I wear a blue uniform now, an Air Force uniform. But I will tell you, anywhere I fly in the world, they speak English on the radio. And the rules are the same as the rules in the United States. And it's because the United States of America led. That's why that happens. The whole ICAO standards, the International Civil Aviation Organization, reflect American leadership. And I think we can do the same thing in space. So this is something, when you think about the constellations that are getting ready to be launched, we're talking about thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit for communications. OneWeb, SpaceX, Boeing, and I guess there's now 11 more that have registered with the ITU. Maybe more than that at this point. That was probably 2 weeks ago that I read that, so it's probably more now. But these are challenges that we're going to have to deal with, because ultimately, and I've heard somebody from one of those organizations tell me that if we don't do anything, the one thing that's assured is that this is our best way to prevent an asteroid from hitting the Earth, because they'll never get through the clutter. And that's not why these systems are being launched. So we ultimately need to, and I'm a conservative Republican, and sometimes I get pushback from my own party on this whole idea of regulation. Friends, sometimes no regulation is regulation. We regulate ourselves right out of the ability to having access to space, and that's my concern for the long term. When you think about next generation, the generation after that, we have to preserve space for the long term. And if we don't do it right, given what's about to launch, not only from these constellations of thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit for communication, but also remote sensing and imagery, with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency coming out with their commercial space policy. Now you've got NOAA coming out with a commercial space policy. Each of these policies will result in constellations of hundreds, if not thousands, for low Earth orbit. So I believe this should be a priority. I believe there are steps that we need to take. The first would be situational awareness, to improve it so that people operating in the free market, making decisions in their own best interest, are making decisions based on good information. One of the challenges we hear, if there's a commercial operator in space and they get a conjunction, analysis from the Department of Defense, the analysis is, well, there's a probability that your satellite's going to collide with this satellite. And the response is, okay, can you give us what that probability is? Is it 1 in 10,000? Is it 1 in 100,000? Is it, what is the problem? Well, we can't share that. That's a challenge, because it makes people know that something could happen, but then not make the right decision based on the truth. And of course, the JSPOC doesn't necessarily want to share that data, because it's important that we keep classified certain things, like our capabilities there. So there are things that need to be done by a civil agency where we can get international support, international partners. And I think this is something where the National Space Council can actually make a difference. Make a difference. And that's starting with space situational awareness, so that we can preserve the space environment for next generation, so that we can ultimately maximize the utility of space, enhance the comprehensive national power of the United States of America, and impact lives on Earth. That's ultimately the goal here, and I think it can be done, but it's going to require American leadership. I'll go through some of these others more quickly, because I know there's probably questions that need to be asked. Second big thing is the weather gap. So on the Science Committee, last Congress I chaired the subcommittee on the environment. So we oversee NOAA. 40% of NOAA's budget is space-based activities. You saw just about a month ago we launched GOES-R satellite into geostationary orbit. And of course the JPSS program, critically important to the guy who represents the state of Oklahoma. When you think about the numerical weather models that help my constituents know where the next severe storm is going to be, 80% of the data that feeds those numerical weather models comes from the low Earth orbit constellations. The one that NOAA operates that matters most here would be the Suomi NPP satellite, which is at the end of its useful life. And if it's at the end of its useful life and JPSS is delayed, what does that mean? That means there's a gap looming. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. God willing, Suomi NPP will continue to operate for another 10 years. But that's not the history here, right? So So what we have to do is figure out if there is a gap, how do we mitigate it? And I have argued that you mitigate it by buying data from commercial operators, and there are capabilities to do that. When you think about GPS radio occultation, this is a technology that's already been matured. We've got private companies now launching satellites into space, one of which already has satellites doing GPS radio occultation. They're not doing it because the government's going to be a customer. They're doing it because their customers are going to be transportation companies and agriculture companies and shipping companies, the insurance companies. That's why they're doing it. So why would the government not say, maybe we ought to be a customer too? We ought to take that data, ingest it into the data assimilation systems, the numerical weather models, and that does two things. Number one, you get more data, number one, right off the bat, and the testimony we've had before the Science Committee is that every additional radio occultation data point improves weather forecasting, and they say at this point we are not seeing any diminishing marginal returns from additional radio occultations. In other words, the more data you get, the better the forecasting. Again, critically important for the guy who represents the state of Oklahoma. So if that's the case, and this is already commercially available, if it's already in space, let's go ahead and purchase commercial data and make weather forecasting better. So I support that. I think there are other technologies that are advancing rapidly that also could be commercial data buys, hyperspectral sensing, for example, and other things. I want to be clear, though, because people have misquoted me on this. I am not in any way suggesting that we don't need JPSS. Nobody cares more about that program than the guy who has constituents in Oklahoma. I'm not in any way suggesting that we privatize the National Weather Service, although people have accused me of that. It is false. We need to augment our current data capabilities, and you do that by buying commercial. And ultimately, if we do that, it's not just about augmentation, it's also about mitigating the gap. And when we do that kind of activity, it's better for all Americans, and it has nothing to do with trying to privatize the National Weather Service. So I wanted to be really clear about that. So I think when you think about the National Space Council, here is another area where we can have a lot of success. Another area would be, I believe we need to have an America First launch policy. And I know there's an international audience here. At least some folks. And so here's the reality I think that we need to be concerned with. When we first started partnering with Russia on launches to the International Space Station, we would buy Soyuz rocket launches at $25 million per seat. Now that we don't have a space shuttle anymore, it's $81 million per seat. That's a challenge. That means we've lost leverage in the marketplace. We've lost the ability to negotiate. You have to remember 80% of the International Space Station is American, and our access to it is dependent on a country that sometimes does not have our best interest in mind. But they do have their best interest in mind, and according to the head of Roscosmos, they're using off-balance sheet financing to build their communications networks in space and their remote sensing capabilities in space. That means they're using American tax dollars, and they're off-balance sheet financing, according to the article in Aviation Week and Space Technology. That off-balance sheet financing is from launching foreign satellites and foreign astronauts. So it's not being appropriated by the Russian government. That's off-balance sheet financing by launching foreign satellites and foreign astronauts. I want to be clear. I support partnerships with anybody in the world who wants to partner with us on the International Space Station or other space venturing opportunities. I support that. We need partnerships. What I will also tell you is that we don't need to be dependent as a country. Partnerships are good, dependence is bad, especially when those dependents might not have your best interests at heart. So, but that's just one piece of the whole puzzle. When you think about the fact that we have multiple launch capabilities that are dependent on Russian rocket engines that we also purchase at a high price, and not just Russia, when you think about the fact that China is launching its own taikonauts on its own rockets to its own space station. They've got their own missions to the moon with a lander and an orbiter and a rover, and they're going into deep space beyond that. and the United States has taken off the table any opportunity to go to the moon because it was a policy decision made by the White House. I think that's a problem in the previous administration. And we built 80% of the International Space Station, and at the same time, we're dependent on foreign countries to get there. That's a big problem. So we need to have, and when you think about launching internationally, when you think about launching on not just Russian rockets, but also European rockets and Indian rockets, all of this, we need partnerships. What we don't need is dependency. And when American companies say, we're going to spend millions of dollars in a foreign country because we don't have the capability in the United States, then I think that's a problem. So how do you do that? I think there are ways we can use tax credits. We can use a policy where if you're going to do a national security launch, you get an added benefit if you're launching American, those kind of things. Number 4, I think we need to reform outdated regulations on the space imagery industry. A lot of companies have been privately capitalized to provide space imagery for the intelligence community, for the Department of Defense, and for NOAA and other agencies. And these privately capitalized companies that are ultimately going to be doing good things for the U.S. government, they have to go get a license. They have to get an approval from NOAA in order to get into space. Well, NOAA, of course, is in the Commerce Department, and they're not always the most responsive to getting a remote sensing or an imagery satellite into space. Well, the question is why? Well, it's not their highest priority, and they're not properly funded to get these licenses out the door. In the meantime, you've got warfighters that need the imagery. You've got combatant commanders that want to know what's happening in their theater. And the commercial providers that can provide the data are being held up by an agency that is not talking to the combatant commanders. So I think we've got to figure out, and this is where the National Space Council can be critically important. It's the interagency process that matters here. And that's what the National Space Council, I think, can do. Bring all the different agencies together and say, how do we enhance the comprehensive national power of the United States as it relates to space, and really kind of break the log jams and start thinking about space collectively as an enterprise as opposed to a tool for different agencies. Last thing where I think the National Space Council could be very helpful is integrating launch into the national airspace. When you think about all of the different commercial constellations that are going to be launched in the next decade or 2 decades, there's going to be a lot more launch necessary. I hope there's launches happening every day in the United States of America at different places around the country. The challenge with that is it clobbers the airspace. And we're going to need more spaceports, and some of those are under development right now, thanks to private capitalization. And we're going to need to be able, as a Navy pilot, I can tell you I've flown in whiskey areas off the coast of the United States, and those whiskey areas enable us to do all kinds of maneuvers and it creates an airspace where commercial traffic doesn't come through. Critically important, and we do the same thing when we launch off the east coast of Florida. We'll just block out those whiskey areas, but when you block out a whole lot of those, they're called warning areas, we call them whiskey areas. You block out a whole host of those warning areas and you do it for a period of 8 hours, that really disrupts air traffic going in and out of Florida, which is a critical place for American commerce. And we've got to figure out how to better integrate American launch capabilities. And it's not just for the east coast of Florida, it's for a whole host of other places around the world. So I think that's an area where the National Space Council can be important. Again, we created, in my office, in the House of Representatives, we created the American Space Renaissance Act not knowing that we were going to have a president and a vice president that were committed to reconstituting the National Space Council. We figured we were going to have to do this legislatively, pushing a rope uphill. And now it looks like we've got a real opportunity to do what is necessary comprehensively. And I think we're going to be able to get it done. So I just want to say thank you for having me. It's always an honor to be here. And if you have questions, I'm happy to entertain them. All right, I'm going to sit down.
Thank you. Q&A here. Thank you. That was a great talk. You hit on a lot of issues and great timing for this conference because we have panel discussions later today on many of these exact topics. I want to start with where you started, your first point on space situational awareness. And of course, it goes without saying that the Air Force and the JICSPOC are going to keep that mission for the military.
Right.
The question is who does it for civil commercial.
Right.
And also, we have to distinguish between space situational awareness and space traffic management.
Right.
Is related but separate activities. One of the discussions we've been having is what is the role of commercial companies in providing some of these space situational awareness services and keeping the databases, if you will,
right.
and providing it as a commercial offering. I won't advertise for any companies, but there are a handful of companies that do this already.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on that and the role of those commercial firms doing some of these activities versus a government agency?
So that's a great question, and that's a problem that we're going to have to solve. I would offer to you that I, as a member of Congress, ought not solve the problem. Because if members of Congress are involved in solving that problem, it becomes very parochial very quick. So I do believe there has to be an agency that's at the helm of it with guidance from Congress. But I would also say that commercial can do the vast preponderance of it. And by that, what I mean is if you look at how the Space Data Association came into formation, these were commercial operators concerned about their own assets, saying we need better space situational awareness. That is, and watching the free market develop and work to a point where they're now investing heavily in their own opportunities to increase safety, tremendously valuable. I will also tell you, though, not everybody participates in the Space Data Association. If you look at, for example, the ComSpOC, you've got commercial operators in space that are saying, we want better situational awareness because we've invested billions of dollars. We want the information from the ComSpOC. Another great example. And there are more. Leo Labs, for example, is creating radars across the world to increase the data for this kind of activity. And if you look at the JSPOC, a lot of their data is coming from sensors around the world. I believe you can take the data out of the JSPOC and share it. I'm talking about unclassified data, share it. And then once that unclassified data goes into whether a civil agency, could be FAA, AST, or some other agency, if it's commercial and it's civil, then you can bring in data from around the world. Our international partners would be willing to say, okay, well, we want access to your data, you want access to our data, let's collaborate. And all of a sudden we're increasing the situational awareness for all players. So when FAA, AST, the key is to have that data shared from the JSPOC and then have that civil agency that can say to commercial, these are the commercial providers that we're comfortable with, in other words, authorized to do the space situational awareness, but not have necessarily FAA, AST do it. And I'm not saying this is the right model. I'm saying these are ideas, these are concepts. I've talked to maybe a lot of people in this room about how to make it happen. But it can happen where you're not creating a stovepiped, government-funded, really, opportunity. But in other words, satellite operators are participating because it's necessary for their own safety, and of course it's necessary for the safety of even our national security assets.
All right. And before I open it up for questions from the audience and you get your questions ready, my last question for you is when it comes to NOAA and their job of licensing commercial remote sensing, how much of an opportunity do you see to deregulate in that, to not just streamline and speed up the licensing process, but maybe switch to a different model that has been suggested before, where it's approval by exception. If you fall within certain parameters, you're allowed to go ahead. You're deemed licensed. If you're outside those parameters that have been established, then they need to go through an interagency review. Do you think there's opportunity for that kind of reform in this administration?
I think there is. And again, this goes back to the National Space Council, because you're going to have to bring the intelligence community and the Department of Defense and the State Department all to the table to figure out what are the national security interests here. And then, of course, then ultimately get to a point where they're comfortable by setting the baseline and say, look, if your capabilities go up to this point but not beyond, then you're assumed approved. But I will also say that when I think about it, presumed approved, there's another challenge here that goes beyond just remote sensing, and that goes to the non-traditional space kind of capabilities. It goes to robotic servicing of satellites that are already in orbit. It goes to commercial habitats or launches to the moon to extract resources. Right now, there's nobody in the federal government that can say yes to any of those activities. And according to the Outer Space Treaty, people say, the Outer Space Treaty says you have to have authorization and continuing supervision from your government in order to do those activities. Some people would say that. Others would say, and we've heard testimony in my committees, that Article 6 resolution in the Outer Space Treaty is not self-executing because it doesn't define what authorization is. It doesn't define what continuing supervision is. The only way you can define that is for Congress to pass a bill. Since Congress hasn't passed a bill, that's not self-executing. So by definition, they are presumed approved. And that is an argument that we have heard. I would tell you that if that's true, and I'm not an attorney, and I'm not going to say whether or not that's an accurate argument or not, but I would tell you that if that is true, it's irrelevant. Because we're hearing from commercial operators that want to do these activities in space that they don't want this presumed approval kind of process to go forward because ultimately the State Department doesn't agree with that presumed approved kind of capability. And if the State Department says we don't agree because they're afraid they're going to you start doing robotic servicing, you're talking about rendezvous and proximity operations. And of course, some people could deem that as provocative or whatever, even though you're only going to be messing with satellites that are customers. But some people could say, well, that's a provocative activity. So the State Department says we want to have some limit on this. We want to have some say over this because it has international implications. Well, if the State Department is saying that, and we want that activity to go forward in the United States instead of in foreign countries, then we have to come to the table as Congress and say, okay, State Department wants to have a say in this process. We need to create this process, bring the certainty, bring the permanence so that it goes from one administration to the next. So certainty is one thing. I think we're going to get certainty from the Trump administration. Regulatory-wise, boy, I'll tell you, he's all about certainty. He's like, not everybody's going to get the answer they want, but you're going to get an answer. And so the certainty is going to be there, but it needs to be permanent from one administration to the next. That means Congress has to pass a law, and ultimately the law has to include inputs from the State Department. And once that certainty and permanence is there, then the capital formation comes in that enables all of our private companies to do these activities. So we have these nuanced arguments about the Outer Space Treaty. But what we have to listen to are what is in the best interest of the United States of America. And in this particular case, it looks like what's in the best interest of the United States of America is also arguably in keeping with the Outer Space Treaty. And when those two things line up, well, let's do what's necessary. So I hope I answered that question, probably more than you ever wanted to know.
You answered my follow-up question before I could even ask it.
Okay.
That's great. All right, so I'll turn to the audience now for questions. So we'll start back here in the back corner.
Thank you. Laura Delgado Lopez with Harris Corporation. Building on that theme of regulation, can you talk about opportunities to re-examine some of the trade or export-related regulations that you see could help U.S. companies augment their business internationally? And do you see the National Space Council helping Congress examine some of those questions? Thank you.
Without question. There is... and this is where when you have a president like President Trump, he is keen on the fact that we want companies doing activities in the United States of America, and we want our companies taking those great capabilities and selling them around the world so that the money is coming here, not going abroad. And because of a lot of the ITAR regulations, just the opposite is happening. Great American companies are making decisions that we're gonna start doing business abroad, and of course that's not in the best interest of the United States. Again, I'm not going to suggest to you that the United States Congress needs to be making these determinations because it only creates more problems. But ultimately, that's to your point exactly. I fully concur. with the idea that the National Space Council, with experts in these areas, can say there are certain parts of the ITAR list that are really no longer relevant. These capabilities have already been democratized. They've already been capitalized, privatized on the other side of the planet. Why are we damaging our ability to do exports here in the United States of America? So I agree with your assessment. I'm not going to give you a list, but certainly that's an area where the National Space Council could provide a lot of, I think, really good guidance.
So when we go over here.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. Congressman, from your position on the Armed Services Committee and in your talks with the new administration, do you get a sense that there's widespread support on Capitol Hill and in the White House for significantly increasing investment in U.S. military space capabilities?
Without question. I mean, absolutely. And I'll tell you, if you look at the defense budget, even during the Obama administration, they were very aggressive in plussing up the national security space budget. A lot of it, of course, is in classified budgets. But when you're talking about a plus up of $5 billion at a time during the sequester and the Budget Control Act, that's a direct reflection of the security implications for what's happening in space. And the testimony that we've had in our committees have been critical to that. So the previous administration saw what was happening and made adjustments. And I would imagine, and Congress, of course, concurred, and now we're going to, I think, see that continue.
So we had another question right over here.
Congressman Bridenstine, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us here at the Space Security thing.
Thank you, General.
I definitely, sort of a follow-on to that question, but I definitely share your optimism on the National Space Council. I applaud your leadership on the civil commercial space things that we're doing, and I agree with removing the space situational awareness, space traffic management from the Air Force, and setting up a civil agency to do that. But now turn back to Space Command. Now that you've done that,
okay.
Do you think it's time to create a Space Combatant Command and restructure the DoD so that it's more focused on management of space, and maybe create a Space Corps so you could get a new color uniform?
So these are big challenges. And if you you think about the subcommittee on strategic forces, of which I'm a member. My chairman is Mike Rogers from Alabama, and he is a very smart and capable chairman that is taking inputs on all these every issue you talked about. We've had private meetings and public hearings on, and he is definitely interested in the organization of military space. We used to have in this country the U.S. Space Command. And of course it got folded into Strategic Command. And so the question is, are we now at a point where we need to have a separate Space Command again? I will tell you that I'm not, the risk of sounding like I'm dodging, I'm not prepared to tell you what my position on it is, because there are as many positions as there are people, right? So if we do something like this, there's going to have to be consensus. And I think when you look at the direction of activities in space, people are seeing it as everybody hears the word congested, contested, competitive. And we want to absolutely do whatever is necessary to reduce the probability of a misconception, some kind of activity that could be perceived as hostile that actually is not intended to be hostile. So I think there's room for it. I think that ultimately we could get there, but I think the process matters. I will also tell you, there was a day when the Army had its own Air Corps. And there was a general that actually went high order, Billy Mitchell, as a brigadier general, shot off every word you can think of in order to convince people that we need a long-range strategic bombing force that is separate from the United States Army. We don't need to be just with the forward line of troops, but we need to be long-range, downrange, strategic bombing capabilities. And he was so vocal about it that he got fired. And of course, there came a day when those strategic bombers were necessary. Hap Arnold actually made that happen. Those strategic bombers became necessary. They were highly leveraged in World War II. One of them was called the Mitchell, the B-25 Mitchell, after him because of his efforts. So he got fired, and then they named an airplane after him because he was so visionary. And when the war was over, we created the United States Air Force as a separate standalone institution. So far, I haven't seen any generals get fired claiming that we need a separate space force. I'm not suggesting that you should have done that, by the way. But that's the kind of impetus that results in that kind of massive transformation, plus events that happen, not events that happen. So what I'd say is we're not there yet, but I'm suggesting that we could get there one day, but there are incremental steps to get there. If you look at how the Army did it, it was the Army Air Corps, then the Army Air Services, and then I guess it was Services and then Corps, kind of like the Marine Corps is to the Navy, the Army Air Corps was to the Army, and then it eventually became the Air Force. So there are incremental steps and processes. We haven't even gotten to the first one at this point, but I think there's going to come a day where that's necessary.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up. Ma'am, I think you had a question right here.
Thank you. I'm Suma Fishman from Euroconsult. I'm wondering where the U.S. Export-Import Bank fits into the toolkit for promoting space activity in the U.S. and increasing exports.
It's critically important. And if you look at the American Space Renaissance Act, we drafted that bill in the middle of a huge fight for the Export-Import Bank. And in that bill, we flat out put in a provision in there that we're going to have basically a backstop for private banking to support space activities, because when it comes to the national security of this country, the United States of America, we need to have the ability to produce satellites. And what's happening now is a lot of those activities are going overseas. And when that happens, then the Department of Defense says, look, we need another communication satellite, a government-owned operated satellite. We need that. And instead of being able to go to a company that is currently making them for maybe SES or Intelsat or Viasat or some other commercial company where they're making them currently, instead of going to a company like that, if we don't do it right, we're going to end up having to recreate the ability to produce satellites, which is far more expensive than just keeping it alive to begin with. So it's a small cost to the U.S. government. In fact, the Export-Import Bank has been a moneymaker to the U.S. government, but it's a small cost. And the challenge we have now, when you don't have a board of directors approved by the Senate for the Export-Import Bank, they're capped at $10 million for any kind of economic activity. Anybody here build a satellite for $10 million these days, like a communication satellite that's important for national security? It doesn't happen, right? That means people are making decisions. It's already happened, where we've lost hundreds of millions, if not over $1 billion worth of economic activity to foreign countries that are now going to have an industrial base that we don't have anymore. That's how important it is. This is about the national security of the United States of America. Now, I will tell you, I'm a conservative Republican, and my position on this might not always be popular, but I'm happy to defend it because I believe it's right. Ultimately, we need to have an industrial base capable of protecting this country. And if we don't do things, as you just mentioned, we lose that industrial base. And then when a bad day happens and we have to get those satellites airborne, it's going to be a whole lot more expensive, and it could be 10 or 20 years before we can get it done. And then it's not the right time. So it's a great question, and I do believe that the Export-Import Bank is important for national security. If nothing else, it's also important for American economic growth and capabilities and keeping us preeminent in space. So thank you so much for having me. It's always an honor to be here.
Congressman, it was a real pleasure to have you. Please join me in thanking Congressman Bridenstine.
Thank you.
I'm Tom Carrico. I'm a senior fellow here at CSIS, and I direct the Missile Defense Project here. And I think we've got a great panel discussion here lined up. Here we are in the middle of a conference on space security. Why are we talking about missile defense? Missile defense is a space problem, and 2 of our 4 families of interceptors operate exclusively in space. And so to kind of address this, we're going to have 3 distinguished gentlemen kind of talk to us about what we ought to be thinking about in this space, in this field. And we're going to start with Rear Admiral John Hill, Deputy Director from the Missile Defense Agency. He's the number 2 at MDA. Kind of give us an update on where things are going there. And then we'll have Pete Hayes, Professor from the Space Policy Institute, to get that right, at George Washington University. And finally, Shuji Maeda, Counselor from the Embassy of Japan. So welcome, gentlemen. Admiral Hill, why don't you start us off? I think kind of give us an update on why space and why the Missile Defense Agency is interested in space.
Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. I wasn't sure who would give up lunch to come hear us talk, so it's just great that you can actually eat while we're chit-chatting. I asked if I could bring my lunch up, and the answer was no. So if my stomach growls, that's just because the microphone's on my belly. But it is great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to join you today. So I was pretty intrigued by the title of the panel, Cooperation between Space and Missile Defense, and the question of why are we interested in space. When I throw a few view graphs up later, I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're doing today in space, which is really kind of walking that ladder to increase our capabilities. But it really kind of traces back to the threat. If you take a look at the ambiguity in launch areas, you look at the types of boosters that are being used or not used, and if you compare that against our intelligence and warning and how that gets compressed, the only real way that we can assure that we've got persistence and full birth to death tracking is to be in space. And so we know we need to move there. There aren't enough islands in the Pacific to plant radars on. Radars are just inherently limited by curvature of the Earth physics, and so being able to look down and see the whole trajectory is pretty critical to what we need to do.
Could you talk to us a little bit about kind of what MDA has been doing there? I like to point out the last 5 presidential administrations have had a space-based sensor layer as a critical part of our national missile defense on paper, but nobody's actually done it. So what kind of are we thinking about now? How, given its inherent utility, what's going on in that area?
Okay. Well, since folks are still eating, how about can I throw up the view graphs now?
Please.
Just because I want to give you full entertainment here. So if we can just go for, do we do that from up here? I think I was supposed to hit a key. Let's see if I can do that. Look at there.
There we go.
Okay, so let me just start here just to kind of center you a little bit on the Missile Defense Agency. This is probably the simplest slide that I could use to explain, both the homeland and the regional architecture. And what you see in that picture there are the sensors across the top, and you'll see that there's some space sensors that are given a nod here. So if you ask us if we're in space today, the answer is yes. We are leveraging space architectures that exist for lots of good reasons. You already mentioned the terrestrial-based radars. Along the bottom, you see the command and control that ties all these different systems together, the foundation of our warfighters through the combatant commanders, regional and strategic, that really drive us. And then along the center, you see kind of a notional threat trajectory. And many of you know, if you're reading the news and if you're studying intelligence, that those threat trajectories aren't going to stay as simple as that picture implies. So you'll see that we have different ways of intercepting, we have different ways of detecting across the 3 phases that are listed there. So the boost phase, the mid-course that the video is kind of really tying into, and then the terminal phase. So we have the ability to intercept. We primarily look at the mid-course phase, and then if you've got to do terminal, we've got capability to do there, and we're very interested in getting to boost phase for lots of reasons. So that space layer starts to play an even more important role, not just in intelligence and warning, but track custody so that you can engage earlier. The earlier we engage, the better before things become more complex. That's probably the easiest way to put it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so is the agency taking steps right now in terms of pushing toward, I think it was your boss, Vice Admiral Searing, who said where the threat is going, it's a must to get to space. but there is no program of record to get there right now. So what is the agency doing?
And so let me reach back and flip this slide over here for you. I think it's that button. There we go. How about that? All right, so this is just a sampling of what we have out today. The way I would characterize the space program, so to speak, within MDA, they are collaborative. We work very closely with the Air Force, work very closely with industry, work very closely with the commercial industry. And really what we're doing is prototyping and experimenting so that we can learn as we go to an operational space layer. So if you look on the left, if you can see it, this NFIRES, right, the Near Field Infrared Experiment. That was really a bird that we put up so that we could measure the phenomenology of boosting missiles. And so capture that data, analyze it, understand it, determine whether or not the technology we're using for sensing is what we want to mature to get to an operational thing. So that's NFIRES, if you've heard of it. And some of you may know that when we deployed that, it stayed up for a little bit, and then we went ahead and we deorbited that in late 15. So she's no longer up there, but what came down was the data, which is what we're using a lot of today. If I talk a little bit about STSS, the Space Tracking and Surveillance System, that I would say is the prototype for what would be a sensing space layer. If you were to ask Admiral Searing, what is the strategy of the Missile Defense Agency, the first thing he will tell you is, I've got to continue improving my sensing capability. I've got to continue getting to precision track. I have to work on overall reliability of the system. And then I have to build out the capacity of the system. And then as I deal with the threat, I have to go to space. And so STSS taught us a lot, still on orbit today. It's been shared amongst other mission areas because of the data that it can see. And so it's got a multi-mission aspect. And so if we were to walk away with one of the big lessons that we learned from STSS is certainly we need persistence, but we ought to make our investments to where we can support multiple missions, whether it's intelligence and warning, or if it's just detection and moving into a precision track, or if it's moving data to firing units on the ground and around the globe. And so STSS has been very successful in helping us there. Kind of on the back end of the engagement space, if you're worried about what we always call shot doctrine, you hear it all the time about the cost per kill. Right? How do you reduce the cost per kill or allow the combatant commander to have some flexibility with shot doctrine? We're looking at something called space-based kill assessment. So we are now leveraging, and what I like about this one, working closely with industry, closely with the commercial base out there to host our sensors on commercial satellites, and allows us to go up and collect phenomenology of intercepts. And so we'll do that. We'll be able to understand what an intercept looks like, when it's occurred, and we can hold back on that other shot or redirect it to something else. Right? So that's the value in that prototype and experiment phase. Let's see what else I have up there. Oh, and there's a little to the right-hand corner, something called a CubeSat. And this is another way of looking how you would develop an operational space layer by putting up clusters of very small, low Earth orbit satellites that allow you, again, to detect early and maintain a track and get to precision track through the life of that threat. So the E on the end of, if you can even read it, is experiment. So prototyping and experimentation right now. I hear a lot out in the press and even amongst ourselves in the world of missile defense. We spend a lot of time talking about how the adversaries are testing, and they're allowing themselves to fail. And they're learning really fast. This is an example of how the Missile Defense Agency is accelerating their learning because we are experimenting, we're prototyping, we are trying technology in the operational space, we are collecting the data, we're assessing that, and we're building upon that knowledge as we move forward to that operational space layer.
Well, now, I heard you say that sort of STSS, which looks an awful lot like the old Sibber's Low. Yep. That is presumably the kind of a template for where we might want to go. We want to produce a constellation of something that looked like that. But on the other hand, you mentioned this CubeSat. Presumably the idea there is a smaller, more distributed constellation. So right. Isn't kind of the path forward, is it a choice between sort of a handful, or not a small handful, but a big handful of STSS-like things, or a much bigger handful of these distributed things?
Yeah, I would say it's, I'm probably the wrong guy to give you a simple answer. Because where my head is today, when you look at the technology that's out there, you look at the existing on-orbit assets, you look at where the Air Force is going, and we're partnered with the Air Force, you look at the commercial launch capability, you look at the ability to partner there, the cost effectiveness of putting something up small and very quickly, the ability to find other launch mechanisms for small clusters of things that can be used very quickly and even brought down very quickly. I think that the space layer it's a new frontier for us, and it does meet what we need, which is full track custody over the long term. For what is becoming a more, I actually heard the term the other day, I love this, we always talk about the evolved threat. Someone used the term mutating threat. And that would be the way I would describe some of the more recent things you've read in the open press. It's a mutating threat, taking technologies and using them a little bit differently. Not necessarily evolving, but surprising us in other areas. The space layer gets us to a point where there's so much flexibility there in that space, and it's a cooperative environment. So we're getting lots of help there. There's lots of interest, and I see it. We were speaking the other day, before the panel, with my friend from the Japanese embassy about how important it is to collaborate. So not only is there a joint U.S. collaboration, there's certainly an allied collaboration that happens there that really allows us to get what we want, which is to have full persistent sensor coverage. And by doing that across services, across the different nations, it's going to do a lot for our security.
So what's next? What's the options going forward?
Okay, well, people are going to start thinking we rehearsed this because I have a slide on what's next.
Pretty simple outline here.
Yeah. Actually, so the good news is, right, it's the last slide, right, of any slide that I'll show. And I'm not going to really speak to the details here because, again, I think this is a template for where we think we're going from a sensor thing. So I would just kind of like to just almost wrap up kind of the Missile Defense Agency story. Number one, we have to be cost effective, right? There's no way in the environment that we live in today, and despite what you're hearing of, truckloads of dollars pulling up to the Pentagon and dumping piles, I just don't see that happening, right? We're going to have to remain very focused in on affordability. And you do that by partnering with other services. You do that by taking advantage of launch capability, either in the commercial world or what DoD is doing or what other agencies might be doing. You do that by leveraging technology across the services, making sure that it's not in some stovepipe in a really great Air Force lab, if you can have access to it and take advantage of what the Navy's doing. So that cooperation in space is really key, and it really helps us to drive affordability on where we're going. And then again, I'll just remind you that the threat is mutating, and we really do believe that the only way to really take that on is to have, rather than a bottom-up view where you're constrained by curvature of the Earth, you got to be up high. It's just kind of basic, and looking down. And our ability to do that is there. The technology is there. It's a matter now of getting it in place, continuing to experiment, to prototype, hone down that technology, and get it into space. So I don't think it's very far away. We've made great strides. We have great capability today, and I think we're ready to take on the threat as it continues to evolve and mutate.
I can't help but notice that this slide has at the bottom, in addition to the usual sort of arc, this depressed trajectory looking thing.
Yeah.
That's sort of the high endo threats.
Right.
And the curvature of the Earth is going to be especially a challenge for a handful of radars if you're trying to go after that.
Right. So I grew up, as an air defender. I'm an old school Aegis guy. I'm the son of an Army air defender. And I spent a lot of time in ballistic missile defense. And we do what most everybody does, is we take our problem and we go after that space, right? So when you take a look at how our systems will focus in on the space battle, and then at the right above the surface battle, and then the overland battle, we tend to build systems that do that. So they're naturally going to be seams, if that's the way you develop, right? So I think our systems do reflect how we're organized. I think where the threat's taking us, it's challenging the battle space. That battle space is converging into one. And if we're not ready to take that on and deal with the fact that very simple Keplerian trajectory, it's not that anymore. It's going to change. We know it can be extended. We know it can be maneuvered. We know you can shoot lofted, different sorts of trajectories, and maneuverability becomes really important in the future. So all of that again, space becomes very important because you can really understand it from space. So thanks for letting me come right back around to that, Tom.
Perfect.
I'll stop saying mutating, though.
Well, Pete, maybe we can shift a little bit. You know, notwithstanding the fact that the utility of space has been recognized for a very long time, there's also been a kind of an allergy to talking about missile defense in space in the same sentence. So I wonder if you might kind of give us some perspective on that and what we ought to be thinking about, maybe besides this sensor layer.
Well, first, I just wanted to mention that I have a good room number for you, sir, when you want to bring that truckload of money to the Pentagon.
I thought it was a river of money under the Pentagon.
Like I say, it's just a rumor. I don't believe it, but hey, you know, I know how to do this now. I'm good for it.
Thank you.
There. Aha.
So this is a graphic that's in the independent working group study, which was last completed in 2009. Several of you in the room actually worked on developing this. And the reason I wanted to show it is because, in my opinion, it does a good job of graphically illustrating where we are conceptually with respect to this problem, and how our thinking is really kind of inverted, at least from a conceptual level, with respect to how one might do a global, especially boost phase missile defense mission. So as you know, for decades, our real focus has been on doing that from land, and there's some real great disadvantages in trying to do that. You're defending at the very tail end of the flight of this thing. It's going the fastest it's ever going to go. If you miss, it's going to hit you. I mean, there's lots and lots of problems with respect to that. You can only cover a very limited geographical area. And so it's just a great challenge. It might be the most politically acceptable aspect of missile defense, but from a conceptual or just programmatic or physical perspective, those challenges are just inherent to trying to defend from land. So one of the things that I find very exciting and encouraging is that we've moved to sea largely with a lot of our missile defense missions, and 70% of the Earth is ocean, as you know, and the Admiral can reinforce that fact, I believe.
90% of people live there.
90%, okay. So that's a great way to deploy these things, and the Navy has really moved out in that regard, and I'm very encouraged by how much more capability that gives to any kind of missile defense system. But the real kind of challenge and taboo, and I really give credit to the Prague Security Studies Institute and the CSIS for bringing these things together. We don't normally talk about missile defense in space together. It's kind of a taboo subject, all kinds of allergies to talking about weapons in space, and you know, we came for peaceful purposes, and we've all seen all those movies and those kinds of things. But I'm here to tell you that this is an unavoidable discussion that we're going to get into more and more as we go forward. I'm surprised no one has made the joke about we're going to make cooperation in space, missile and defense great again. I mean, we are going to do that, folks. That's
I've
going
been
to
on that
happen
panel, actually.
in this administration. So why is space so important for missile defense? Well, bottom line is, if you want to do global boost phase missile defense with current technology, there is one place where you can base those systems, and that is in space. So that's really the bottom line. I mean, the Admiral talked a lot about sensors in space. This is the next logical step. I think it follows in line of what the United States has done with things like a Predator, where we said it's nice to look at these things, but it would be even nicer if we could schwack them while we're looking at them.
Could you, you said if you want to do global boost phase, but why, can you talk us through, why you might want to do that? What is it that that boost phase gets you, but also some of the challenges to that, operational challenges, salvos, et cetera.
And let me emphasize from the outset, I really agree with what many of the speakers said this morning. The greatest value of space, in my judgment, is the way that it inspires the next generation to go out and do great things. And I'm very much enthusiastic about all the visions that folks like Elon Musk and others have. But again, if we don't get the security piece right, we're never going to realize those dreams. And so that's really what I'm most concerned about. I want America to be a large part of that discussion. And again, I think this is just inevitable that we need to come around to it. So with respect to why space is so important, The Admiral talked about all the sensing capabilities that space affords, that positional advantage you get in space. When you start talking about intercepting things, the other great positional advantage is actually the velocity that you get from being in orbit. So the folks that first designed the smart rocks that evolved into brilliant pebbles, which was Lowell Wood and Greg Canavan, they talked about just really bending the orbit of these things to intercept a ballistic missile, which, oh, by the way, is going to come right up by you. To do an intercontinental range ballistic missile, your apogee is probably about 2,500 miles high. So it's well above the low Earth orbit where these things are coming. So they're coming up to see you. You have orbital velocity, and it's really a matter of bending that orbital velocity to intercept with that vehicle. It may not be precisely in the boost phase. It may be in the post-boost phase. Lots of discussion about what those things are, lots of variables, of course, but the earlier you can do that, the more likelihood there is that you hit all the warheads in that vehicle. The more likely it is that it falls down back on the heads of the folks that launched it instead of your allies or yourself. And some other really great advantages are, no one's figured out a way to do a launch into space without this big fiery plume coming out the back. You can't hide that. Okay, so it's very easy to see that with a variety, multispectral type of sensors to see that. You can get great fidelity on that. Even the maneuvering around of a post-boost vehicle, the thrusters on that are very easily seen. Again, this target is coming up to you in low Earth orbit, so the distance to intercept becomes smaller and smaller. You get multiple shots at it, lots of great things. Challenges, you mentioned. That whole space weaponization debate. Many in this room will find this whole discussion anathema to them because they saw different movies than I did, and they understand that we came in peace for all mankind, and how dare us talk about that. Well, again, in my judgment, this is just an inevitable discussion that needs to be made more robust, not just in the United States, but worldwide. The technologies to do this are more than 30 years old now. And I just wanted to highlight that in 1989, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff certified that he wanted to have Brilliant Pebbles be the phase 1 boost defense system for the Department of Defense. That never went forward because the Cold War ended and the need for that went away. But it wasn't because of a technological challenge. And again, I would highlight to you that that was 30-year-old technology. I guarantee that the sensors, the computing power, the network needed to enable this type of capability has all proceeded forward rapidly and would only result in a cheaper, better system today than we would have had in the late 1980s.
Okay, good. Did you want to show something else?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. So this is a graphic depiction of a brilliant pebble. I hope many of you might be familiar with this, but I fear many of you may not. So there's two main components to it. The thing that's splitting in half is usually referred to as a life jacket. So it's a protective shell around that small thing that's a little bit hard to see that's towards the left bottom corner, which is the actual kill vehicle. And so the life jacket provides the power and communications and just basically protection from the space environment for the kill vehicle itself. When the intercept is to be made, it's going to open up, and the kill vehicle is the thing that actually has the end game sensors as well as thrusters to align itself to collide with the incoming either a booster or post-boost vehicle or maybe an individual warhead.
Good, good. Well, thank you, Pete. Shuji, the United States and Japan have been working together on missile defense very intensely. We're all delighted to see the SM-32A successful intercept this past year. I wonder if you might give us a Japanese perspective on space for missile defense, for all of these missions, for sensing, and what we ought to be thinking about from an allied perspective.
Yes, happy to. And thank you again for inviting me on this such a distinguished panel. Missile defense or missile threat is very big in our mind when we think about our security policy. There's a growing sense of missile threat in the environment, security environment surrounding Japan. So Japan and the United States have been very strong, good partners in the missile defense area. We have been conducting joint studies for SM-3 Block 2A. And recently, in 2015, we have adopted the new defense guidelines. And in that, for the first time, I think, missile defense has its own chapter, and also space, and together with cyber, as an independent chapter. So that shows how strongly both Japan and the United States have been thinking about those issues when we think about the direction of our security strategy together.
And you know, Japan is in a bad neighborhood, but not only is it a bad neighborhood, it's a tightly compressed neighborhood. And so the windows, this is all about time and space. Whether you're talking about the interceptors, whether you're talking about the sensors, it comes down to time and space management as much as anything. And so for the short window of time between North Korea and Japan, these kinds of sensing can buy precious seconds, right?
Yes, that is clearly recognized by the policy-making circle in Japan, and that's why we are stressing the elements of information sharing, interoperability between Japan and the United States. The alliance has been the key pillar of our security policy. I mean, the Japanese alliance with the United States has been the key pillar of our security policy, and even in that guideline that I mentioned, that element of information sharing, interoperability, and the cooperation, exploring the possibility of bilateral cooperation in those areas with the United States has been clearly shown as the goal that we should be pursuing.
Yeah. Good. Well, actually, I think what I'd like to do is open it up to questions, so we can have folks come around with a microphone, unless you want folks want to interact with one another, which you're welcome to do. So just raise your hand, and we'll get started. We've got one gentleman right here, one in the back, right there.
Gentlemen, Aaron Bateman, is there still an effort to utilize directed energy? If so, what's the status?
Yeah, so from the missile defense side of the house, we are making, I would say, modest investments in directed energy. When I came over from the Navy, modest investments in the Navy as well. I think the struggle has been to get to the kind of power and weights that are required for specific missions. So for the Navy, it was about operating on the sea, on a ship, and dealing with the atmosphere. For the Missile Defense Agency, directed energy was more than likely going to be at altitude, right? So we don't deal with those physics, but now we deal with the packaging problems and the power required in order to, whether you're going to sense or if you're going to try to destroy something. So we do have efforts in place today where we're doing technology demonstrations. We have 3 companies now that we're carrying through a PDR, likely through a CDR, to come through that first level of just maturation of the technology to see if we can in fact get it at altitude to execute a mission. So that's where we are from a missile defense perspective.
And if I could kind of connect that with space, I mean, what we're really talking about for the ConOps here is putting it on UAVs for the longer range mission, but that's at very high altitudes, right?
It is.
Would need to be at very high altitudes. But then also, you mentioned very modest amounts. Correct me if I'm wrong, but very low numbers keep getting cut in the appropriations process, and the CRs don't help with that. Is that correct? Is that holding it back?
CRs never help anything, and I think right now, just where we're at, I can't really comment on specific budget numbers since we don't have those now. But I would tell you, I'd like to move out further. It's funny, I had an interesting discussion with Admiral Searing last night about this, because we're also teaming up with the Office of Naval Research. We're looking at what everyone is doing across the DoD and what you have in industry. And it does come down to the maturation of that technology for its specific mission use. And it's just, we're not where we want to be. So the question is, do we keep investing from our perspective, excuse me, or do we let industry and academia continue to mature that technology, and then we capture that once it's matured more? So I think we're just kind of caught in that right now. You know, big investments right now to weaponize what we've got, or let it continue to bake. Does that make sense?
Tom, I'd like to just touch on that as well, maybe from a more conceptual perspective. And I don't think any area better highlights the inherent interrelationship between missile defense and space than directed energy. The amount of energy needed to be deposited on a warhead in particular is a lot, but the amount of energy you need to deposit on a satellite is probably a heck of a lot less. So, it kind of highlights that you can't divorce these kind of technological things. And again, from my judgment, these kind of discussions are really long overdue. So, in that regard, just some specifics. In 1997, the United States tested against the MISTY-3 satellite with our Mircal laser in New Mexico. So during that actual test event, the main laser didn't work. And we used the targeting laser, which is a 40-watt laser. So the same 40-watt light bulb in your refrigerator, okay? Not a whole lot. So that fused together some of the pixels on the satellite in low Earth orbit. That should be kind of instructive to us. Let's flash forward to the airborne laser program. So in February of 2010, I can't talk about the details on how much power that could deposit, but it was successful in shooting down 2 representative types of missile threats. Our Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, decided that it's too expensive, and that plane's now cut in half down at the Boneyard. So I don't know how to put all those things together, but again, in my judgment, those kind of discussions and dialogues need to take place, because the technologies are right here now. It's really more political decisions and value decisions about where the best investments are to be made.
Yeah, hey, Pete, can I add on to that a little bit? So I probably should have mentioned airborne laser, and I'm glad you brought it up. And I'll go back to sort of that philosophical view of, you got to get out there, operate in the environment so you can learn and then figure out where you're going to go, right? So big chemical lasers in aircraft, that's a tough concept of operations, right? How do you get that many of them, where they need to be, and I kind of already mentioned the deception that can be used in a launch area, for example, makes that a real challenge from a economist's perspective. So if we can get to the kind of power and weights that we need to be at altitude, whether it's on a UAV or something else, then I think we're in business. So it still comes down to the technology trades, right? A lot of investments going into fiber combined lasers, a lot of, there's sheet lasers, there's lots of different types of technologies out there. But the other point I wanted to make is when you say directed energy, you also have to consider it's not just about lasers. There are other types of energy that can be directed that we are in that prototyping experimentation phase within the Missile Defense Agency.
Can I redirect that back to you about technology development? You were talking about space sensors before. But is that really an area that needs all this, extensive R&D work, or are the EO, IR sensors that you're talking about putting up there, don't we already have that?
We do, and some of the examples I gave you were EO, IR sensors where we collected some data, and I think the technology is there to go there. So it now comes down to that cost trade and launch capability, which I think we've now reached that point to where the synergy we have with the Air Force, synergy we have, as the Air Force figures out, like say that the ground station architecture, what that should look like, and how can we do multi-mission and have one common way of doing that, how you move data around. So that's a pretty big leap forward. They're doing an analysis of alternatives on that now that ties right back into what we're doing for our analysis of alternatives on sensors. And so I think the short answer is yes, the technology's there. Can it be better? Can it be affordable? And can we get it up quickly? I think there's a lot to be said for what we can do now.
Okay. Who else we got? This gentleman right here in front. Just try to get my attention if you have a question.
Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Vyacheslav Kosarev. I'm from Russian Embassy. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. It's a very interesting topic, and it's also in interest of Russia, of course. And this picture reminds me one of the James Bond movies when a space shuttle swallowed others, both Russian and US rockets, or I don't know how it was called, spaceships. So my question, the first one, is about militarization of space. What do you think are the prospects and perspectives of United States of America and their allies joining and sharing the idea of not placing weapons in space first? This idea is widely discussed in international community, especially it is supposed to be discussed in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and from year to year we are having resolution.
Can we let the folks answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
On this.
All right.
And the second one is a quite precise one. What we heard from the news 1 or 2 weeks ago, that one of the options that U.S. administration was considering about reacting nuclear threat from DPRK was placing back U.S. nukes to South Korea. As you may know, or you all know, that 25 years ago, U.S. already had their nukes on the territory of the Union.
All right, so that's for deployment of...
Thank you very much.
Okay, that's probably a little far afield from where we are. But the first question, will the United States be first to militarize space? Somebody want to take that?
Well, I'll answer that from my personal theoretical perspective again, is that what I tell my students, I teach a course on space and national security, so in my judgment, the United States should not be first or second to weaponize space. And what do I mean by that? We should not proactively go forward, rushing forward, especially without a dialogue amongst our allies, with respect to such a controversial and fraught issue. But by the same token, if we make no effort towards preparing for that eventuality, as the Space Commission, among others, told us, it's inevitable that space will eventually be weaponized, as all other domains that man has encountered will be weaponized, then the United States will not be prepared for that eventuality. So it's a difficult balancing act that we have to follow, in my judgment. And it doesn't serve us to rush ahead or rush unilaterally, in particular, with that issue.
Yeah, for me, I'll just go look at the program of record and tell you from a Missile Defense Agency perspective, there's nothing in our program of record about putting weapons in space.
Okay. All right, who else we got? We got Bruce and somebody over here. In the back? Actually, right there in the back, right there. Right to your left, sir.
Yes, sir. My name is Kammi Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is in the perspective of what's going on in South Asia. And it's a general question. It's not very specific about this field, but these two countries, India and Pakistan, are wasting billions of dollars in this space adventure to just, defeat each other in future. Is there any sense of guilt about this in you gentlemen's mind, that it's U.S. who is leading this research and somehow making those countries paranoid that if they don't, invest more money, majority of those people are living below poverty line in these two countries. If you comprise with,
this is the question, the 104 satellites?
Make comparison with these states. But so, is there any sense of guilt about this? Thanks.
All right. Do you feel guilty about the 104 satellites launched by India? Well, let me try to rephrase that a little bit. I think the idea is the United States and perhaps its allies are contributing to some kind of space military activity. I think that's fair to say. Anybody want to respond to that? All right, or not. Let's go to Bruce. Let's go to Bruce.
I'm sorry.
All right, we got the statement made. All right. Bruce McDonald.
Bruce McDonald, Johns Hopkins University. Pete, I wanted to follow up with your point about missile defense in space. And conceptually, I agree with you. I think sooner or later we've got to grasp that nettle and deal with it from a policy perspective. The problem I have with like Brilliant Pebbles and an approach like that is that, and I'd be interested in your responses to it, is one, the vulnerability problem. You're out there and you're potentially quite vulnerable to somebody with like a ground-based laser just shooting at you, and there's which could be, in terms of a crisis dynamic, could be actually kind of scary. Secondly, the problem of, the technical term is absentee ratio with orbiting thing. 95% of your weapons won't be in the right place at any given time. And then finally, one of the things that I did like about the airborne laser program was a supporter of it. I thought it didn't work out, but the right thing to do was to test it out and find out what the pluses and minuses are, and kudos for that. But the great thing about a 747 is you can land it and do maintenance. And once you put something up there, kind of tough to do maintenance on that. Not completely impossible, but tough. How do you deal with those issues, let's call them, with something like a modern day version of Brilliant Pebbles?
Well, thanks for your question, Bruce. I mean, you've raised a lot of the real key issues that would need to be overcome if, in fact, we were going to go forward with this kind of deployment. So first, you mentioned directed energy. Well, it's no accident, comrades, that that's white. I'll just leave it at that. The life vest here. The other thing you get out of having a distributed architecture, I mean, we're talking about thousands of these vehicles, maybe 4,000 at a minimum. So the vulnerability of each individual node probably doesn't matter for the overall system operation. Paul Nitze, as you know, had some criteria for deploying any kind of ballistic missile defenses, and he said first it shouldn't be vulnerable. I think the distributed nature of this architecture reduces that vulnerability, certainly gets rid of single point failures. And the second thing is that it needs to be cost effective on the margin. So the amount of money invested in the defense, the next incremental dollar is more valuable than the next incremental dollar on the offense. So I think if you can bring down the cost of this deployed system, and what they were shooting for back in the late 80s was $1 million per pebble on orbit. Again, from my perspective, with the advances in launch technology, sensors, computing power, networking, I believe we could do significantly better than that. You probably disagree. Knowing about how the defense acquisition system works, I would not disagree with your disagreement. But the point is, theoretically, I think NHTSA has some good criteria to use. Absentee ratio. I think one of the logic points in that inverted pyramid is that the people that really have the biggest absentee ratio are ground-based sensors. They're not going anywhere. They can only intercept things that happen to come into a small field of view that they can have purview over. Space, at least, is engaging multiple areas of the world on every orbit, and yes, many of them won't be available to shoot at any particular launch, but the overall architecture will be available, and again, it's the only place where you can deploy a system today that can do global boost phase intercepts. So to me, that's kind of I want to say it's a specious argument from the perspective of the entire system, because the system is designed to overcome that issue with respect to absentee ratio. And if you want higher probabilities of kill, you simply add more. It's a very scalable type of system, which you don't get that ability in the other architecture designs.
And those challenges of resilience and vulnerability, those would apply to space sensors too, right? I mean, that's going to be something to come up with even a distributed sensor layer.
Right. Let me say, I'm a fan of boost phase intercepts. Don't get me wrong on that.
Okay. Who else? Roger.
Yes, Roger Robinson. As a European-based think tank at PSSI, we've certainly taken note of the allergic reaction, as I think described by Pete, to the notion of space-based missile defense among many in Europe, certainly in our country, and needless to say, in Russia as well. But I would submit that the scandal here, to the extent that there is one, is not the temerity of folks like Pete and Tom and others who advocate near-term space-based missile defense for the United States, but it's rather the fact that it's not already up and fully operational. That's the scandal. I mean, I go back to the Reagan administration and Lowell Wood days when we already had Brilliant Pebbles, as it's been stated. This is 30-year-old technology that's vital to defending the United States, and we're still, in effect, dithering, with no offense to Admiral Hill and the team. I was wondering, though, when might we be able to expect, in rough terms, an operational capability? Thank you.
Yeah, so you said a lot there, most of which I can't respond to. I'll kind of go back to what I said earlier, is that we are prototyping, experimenting, learning a lot. We've already done a lot over the last 15 years in space. So I wouldn't say that it's not all there. And if you look at where we are today with our interceptors and what we're doing with the ground systems, there's a lot of heritage that ties back to the times that you just mentioned. So that technology moved forward, and we're continuing to improve that technology, and it has a natural glide slope to take us to that other frontier. But it really does come down to time and investment there. And without it, we just don't have the program of record for me to declare a timeline for weapons in space, right? I'm just going to stay away from that. See, Pete told me the other day, hey, I can say that. I'm the academic guy on the panel, and I said, well, I can't say that. But from the operational space layer perspective, we're moving out in that, and you're going to see that as part of, whenever we can openly talk about the budget, we'll get a good sense on the timeline. But I would say it's a lot closer than what you might think in terms of capability in space. And sensing really is important, right? You can't shoot anything unless you can see it, right? So where you shoot it, that's another debate, and it's an interesting one. But for now, the Missile Defense Agency is really focused in on sensing and precision track globally.
Could I just add, I really appreciate your question, and I think those are raising some fundamental issues. So from my perspective, what I am most concerned about is I believe that these decisions are almost purely political and about our values and those kinds of things. It's not a technical issue. Right. This is pretty old technology now. So I also am concerned about the narrative being that, well, we already looked at all this stuff and we decide to reject it because we don't have the technology. And that's just wrong. I mean, the Cold War ended. That's why we didn't go forward with these things. And I'm here to tell you, the Soviet Union was very concerned about this. If you read interviews with Gorbachev or Shevardnadze or any of those kinds of people, this was foremost on their mind. As you're probably aware, the Russians, Soviets tried to launch a 75-ton laser battle station in 1987. That didn't work. It didn't reach orbit, but it's not like they weren't going forward with similar type of technology. So the Cold War ended. That's why these things came apart. There wasn't the political need to do it. I would submit that today there's more of a political need than there has been in the recent decades. And again, it's just, in my mind, it's an inevitable dialogue that needs to be had internationally because the technology is here. So it's really about what we're going to do with it.
All right, who's next? I'll re-engage. One question I've got is, Pete, you just mentioned that maybe it's not high technology that stands in the way, and you mentioned the same in our exchange earlier, but there are kind of the operational problems.
Yes.
And Bruce, I think, already pointed to that, opening up a hole in any kind of orbital thing. There might be some good operational reasons that you want having effectors on the ground. You might want to have a lot more flexibility about where you send them, whereas in some ways you put them in orbit and they're stuck. You're not able to maneuver them as much, right? Would that be a fair rejoinder?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with the basic logic that the Hoffman and Fletcher panels did back at the beginning of the SDI program, that you need a layered defense system. And I would not want to rely just on a space-based layer. But I also do believe that the logic in that pyramid is correct, that you get all kinds of positional and velocity advantages in space that are not possible in other domains.
And actually, I think I want to re-engage on you, and that is, we were kind of talking about the space sensor layer in terms of long-range discrimination problem.
Right.
But aren't there tremendous advantages from the space sensor layer for, frankly, the whole BMDS, which you had up there? And so, what is it that a space sensor layer could do for lower tier interceptors? Not merely high altitude OPIR, but what is sort of a low or medium orbit tracking and discrimination layer do for the Patriots and the THAADs and Aegis of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you take a look at some of the advanced threats, and we talked about how those trajectories are changing, and if you look at what they're targeting, they tend to be more of a regional threat, right? So some of the systems that you mentioned now, we got to deal with it, right? And it turns out if you look at that problem of a very advanced threat, which is, it's here right now, right? And really the only way to ensure you've got track custody is to be in space. Right. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, that the battle space is converging. It's one space. Right. This is no longer a above the atmosphere battle versus in the atmosphere battle or on the surface battle. Right. This is the whole battle space, and it includes space. And so we're going to have to figure out how we're going to sense that whole battle space, how we're going to detect and track there, and how we're going to put weapons on the credible objects. And so that's, I think there's great advantage for both regional and homeland.
And what I was fishing for there was, what it permits in terms of launch on remote or engage on remote. Which is to say, launching your things a lot earlier.
You bet.
Because of that. Yeah. In other words, what is the hard meaning of that precision? It means you can do more things with what you've got, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the earlier you detect and get a firm track, I mean, that's really the only way you're going to put a weapon on target, right? You've got to have a full detection and precision track on that. So the earliest way to get it, and it's how we operate today, is from space. Right, so the further out you can go, the more engage on remote capability you have, and in fact, that's the use of space objects or space capability today is just the communications. Command and control is at the core, and we tend not to talk about that a lot. We get excited about sensors, get excited about weapons, but the command and control that's either in a ground station or in something aloft or something on an airplane, something on a ship, the command and control that's moving that data and determining what data to move and what latency and what repetition rate becomes really important as we leverage the goodness of space. And I'm with you, Pete. It's not going to ever be about just, hey, now we're in space, we can go get rid of everything else, right? The world that I want to live in, the kind of ship I want my daughter to be on is a ship that's got its own radar and it's connected. I want her on that kind of ship that is connected to that global network. And that global network will include terrestrial-based sensors, ship-based sensors, mobile sensors, all of that tied into networks that are in space and elsewhere. So I think that's really the conversation we're having here is how connected we're getting in that very large battle space now.
If I could add one thing to that point about global network of forward sensing and all that. Japan is hosting 2 X-band radars for the U.S. missile defense system. And in addition to developing our own missile defense capability, we are hosting a lot of the United States missile defense assets in Japan. And we're trying to strengthen the overall alliance capability for the missile defense for both of our countries. So I think that is one aspect of alliance contribution to the global network of missile defense systems.
Great.
And can I take a moment just to congratulate Shuji and the country of Japan for the incredible performance of the SM-3 Block 2A during its first intercept. That's a cooperative program that we jointly came through together. I was a young commander when we came up with the idea, working with Japan, to go off and build an interceptor together. And for me, it's just great to report back to the Missile Defense Agency after all this time and to see the first intercept. Amazing. And so what that means for Japan's security, what it means for the U.S., that's just a perfect example of international cooperation, all about national security.
And it has
so
been a symbol of Japan-U.S. security and defense cooperation. And our colleagues at the Ministry of Defense are very much proud of what they have been working on, and
we all are.
The entire government of Japan has been, admiring that symbolic project that we've been working on.
With effects back to the trilateral side, that'll go into Europe for NATO, and that's the kind of a capability that really and truly blurs the lines between homeland and regional.
Oh, yeah.
All of a sudden, something that is very exo-atmospheric has long-range capabilities too. Russ.
Hi, Russ Matijevich, Hawkeye 360. Maybe this is a good question to end on, but what role do you see or would you like to see the commercial space industry play in shoring up what you guys are trying to do in the space layer and beyond in your missile defense mission?
That's probably a good close for all three panelists.
Yeah, it's, that is the perfect cooperation between space and missile defense question. Certainly, we have, by leveraging the commercial side of the house, we're seeing huge cost advantages, right? So that's important in this world, particularly when you start talking about numbers in space. So just use that as just a very simple example. We have a great relationship with the commercial lift side of the house, and for commercially based satellites. That relationship just has to continue. That's the only way that we can very quickly get the operational space layer to become a reality, is working closely with industry. So there's just the fundamentals of just launch capability. That's
your mic
important.
is just
Did my mic go out?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Russ can hear me, so that's. So launch capability is important, but I would say continue to mature technologies that we're going to need. Right, I tell you, serving at the Missile Defense Agency is just great because I work with some of the finest scientists and engineers on the planet. But we don't know everything, right, in the halls of our little cell there. So we go to industry all the time, right? We do RFIs to industry. We ask about technologies. We're not shy about it, right? What's it going to take to get into space, right? What do we need to do this sort of sensing, to do that sort of algorithm? What do we need for command and control on the ground and to link all these different disparate pieces together? So I would say continue to mature the technology and come talk to us. We want to talk to industry, big and small. Because I think that's where there's so much innovation there, and I think all of us have kind of said that the technology's there. Now it's a matter of how do you get it in the right application, and it's going to be different across the services. The needs of the Army will be different from the needs of the Navy, different from the Missile Defense Agency, different from the Air Force, and that is okay. But wouldn't it be great, just back to the directed energy question, if we were all investing on the right technology that we can move very quickly across all services and with our allies? That would be fantastic. I think today we're in a lot of different pockets. So I think collaboration, lots of talking, very important.
Let each of you briefly respond to that too, and then I think we are out of time. Okay. So.
You need that? Actually, you may not
I think I don't.
Yeah,
but
me off, though.
Okay. I think that's a great question and a great way to end. And the thing that's exciting to me is that there is so much synergy between what the commercial sector is going towards and the types of distributed architectures with greater resilience. So the overlaps between that is fantastic. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of opportunities for more places to host sensors and driving down the cost of doing those kinds of architectures for whatever purpose, and the launch opportunities as well. So I think that's an exciting set of synergistic type of things that are emerging, and I think it's an important part of the discussion going forward.
It is an important topic for the government of Japan too. We have a national security strategy adopted about 4 years ago or so, and it mentions, along with the promotion of the defense industrial base, there is a reference to the space industry as one of the areas that we would look at. So there's a growing sense in Japan about the importance of the cooperation with the commercial sector. And together with the United States, we will explore various ways to pursue that goal.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. We are definitely out of time. Please join me in thanking the panelists.